people of all different races who were there just expressing their outrage about this travesty of justice here. Here was a guy who was murdered on February 26th. It's been 25 days since that time, and still no arrest. And I think for a lot of people like myself, we feel like our lives are meaningless. You know, that could have been me. That could have been my godsons, both of whom live in Florida, who are teenagers, who could have been arrested and shot, who could have been shot by a neighborhood watch captain who wasn't even officially on duty doing that. I just think that there's so many questions about the investigation, about the story, that you wonder how many times this happens that it just doesn't get attention. This is not the only time.
And I want to come back to that point, but Trayvon's parents, who we just saw in that opening clip, have started an online petition calling for the prosecution of the shooter. This morning, there were 985,000 signatures on that petition. But there's no grand jury until April 10th. We mentioned that Zimmerman hasn't been charged, and he still has a gun. Joanne, what needs to happen here?
Well, I think these are all the layers of this case that are making it viral, frankly. And I think social media has also played a big part in it. You know, a case like this, you figure 20 years ago, wouldn't have gotten this big this fast because you wouldn't have had that viral element. So I think the issue for police now is that they are not going to arrest. They seem to be very dug in, the police here in Sanford, on the idea that Zimmerman was the one who was being aggressed. And they're dug in on that, and they don't seem to be backing down. But the pressure is now coming internationally to relook at this law that Zimmerman is supposedly using, the Stand Your Ground law, to look at the gun laws, the idea that this guy actually had a prior arrest and still had a legal license to carry, and to really just look at police procedure. Why is it that police are saying that under existing law here in Florida, they actually were in the right, and they're insisting on that? So hopefully the grand jury will flesh out some of the other questions, like why wasn't the cell phone used to identify Trayvon Martin for 3 days? Where is Trayvon Martin's cell phone? There are a lot of questions unanswered. Why didn't police do what reporters did and follow up with the last person to speak with him on the phone? There are a lot of unanswered questions that hopefully the grand jury will help to heal and answer.
Yeah, so many layers. It's hard not to imagine being a parent, thinking your child is missing, and if there's a cell phone with a home number in it, why it's not called. I mean, that's one little simple piece of this whole thing.
How hard is that to do that? I mean, the police were totally incompetent in their investigation, completely inept. I mean, they didn't look at the cell phone to find out who it was. They didn't bother to do a drug test or an alcohol test on George Zimmerman. They didn't bother to do a background check on George Zimmerman. The police chief goes out in public and slanders and smears the name of Trayvon Martin, accuses Trayvon Martin of beating the crap, those were his exact words, beating the crap out of George Zimmerman because he had a bloody nose, which wasn't even in the initial police report. It came in the second police report. There's so many unanswered questions. The idea that Police Chief Lee says this investigation was colorblind, it just doesn't sound realistic when you consider that if the roles had been reversed, if Trayvon Martin had been white and George Zimmerman had been black, you bet your butt there would have been an arrest. And I think that it's crazy today that we live in a society that this is recognized as injustice, and there still has not been any sort of justice yet, any arrest.
I want to bring in the president of the NAACP, Ben Jealous. And Ben, I really appreciate you taking the time this morning. And I know that the NAACP has been collecting stories from people who accuse the police of abuse or failing to adequately investigate cases. I'm wondering what you found out in that forum.
We sat there, and I got to say, you know, I've done a lot of hearings in my career, all of them well planned. This one was more of a y'all come. We were at a large meeting in a church the night before, packed to the rafters. There were people lined up at the mic, and we knew we couldn't hear all the stories. So we just said, y'all come back at noon tomorrow to the church and tell us your stories. And there, with cameras in front of us, not knowing what the next person would say, mother after grandmother after mother after brother after uncle, after victim stood up and said, I've been racially profiled. My son was racially profiled. My son was killed, and they did not investigate his case. It's been 2 years. One woman talked about 2 years, her nephew, since he was killed holding his baby. And every month they call the local cops here in Sanford, and they say, oh, we're getting close, we're getting close. But the sense that there's two real problems in this town. One, black men, black boys are suspected of being criminals simply because they are black. And two, when they are killed, it is not taken seriously. It is not investigated seriously. Cases are routinely mishandled even when they get to court. And that's what we heard. And it was absolutely heartbreaking. This is a town of 50,000 people, just up the road from Orlando, that has 1 million people. It's been in the news twice since 2010 for people walking free after assaulting or killing black men. This city has a real problem.
There was a story on Nightly News last night that was shot in Georgia. And it was basically about what it means to be a young black man in America. I want to play you a little bit of that story.
My mom always told me to just go with what the cop says, never argue with him. Every time I'm out at a public event or a cop sees me down the street or a security officer sees me down the street, he asks me, where are you supposed to be, boy? And you can sort of tell that it's not the same treatment that they give everyone else.
You are constantly having to make psychological adjustments to watch the way your hands are moving, to watch your posture, to watch the way that your feet are moving, to make sure that you don't make an abrupt movement. And that may mean that you have to compromise a bit of your pride, but I want you back home alive.
I want to bring in Congresswoman Frederica Wilson. Congresswoman, thank you very much for being with us. And you have a son. Your Trayvon was in your district. And it also caught my eye when I read that you're the head of a mentoring organization that passes out pamphlets that explain what happens if a child is arrested. Given that, was the death of Trayvon Martin a shock to you?
It was not a shock to me. I have seen it happen over and over again. And it's a conversation that we must never end. We must talk about it. We must educate our young boys. We must talk to police officers. We must educate them, because there is this natural tension between black boys and the police. It's not a perceived tension. That tension exists, and we have to find ways to calm that tension, because it always leads to trouble. So our brochures, and in the 5,000 Role Models of Excellence Project, which is the mentoring program, we teach our young boys how to avoid a confrontation with the police. And it's always keep your hands where they can see them. Freeze, don't move. Never run from the police. And it's 12 different rules, and we practice them, and they're taught this information by police officers who are mentors in the 5,000 Role Models of Excellence Project.
Ben Jealous, how is it that we still have organizations that have to pass out pamphlets to young African-American boys telling them, make sure if you see a police officer, they can see your hands?
Here, you know, we are now on the eve of being 150 years since the end of slavery. And black men and black boys in our society are still suspect, still believed to be criminal simply because of their color, simply because of their heritage. It's got to end. I mean, it's, you know, how is it that we as a country can tolerate the fact that millions of parents in this society, because of the color of their child's skin, are forced to sit there and give their children daily instructions on how to survive? You know, good kids like Trayvon, beautiful kids, just fearing for their lives every single day, sometimes fearing for them even when they're grown up, because the reality is that black boys, when they become black men, are just as vulnerable to being mistreated, to being wrongfully suspected, to being wrongfully killed, and when they are killed, to having their case mishandled by law enforcement, who, quite frankly, too many instances have become jaded about that's just one more black man who's dead.
You know, Congresswoman, a lot of this has to do with Florida's controversial Stand Your Ground law. 2005, justifying using deadly force if you think your life is threatened, and not just in your home. Let me play for you a clip of what one of the sponsors of that law, State Representative Dennis Baxley, had to say about how it applies specifically to Trayvon's case.
There's nothing in the Castle Doctrine statute that provides authority for you to pursue or confront other people. This is a self-defense law. There's nothing in the statute to protect somebody who is pursuing and confronting other people.
Congresswoman, in your home state of Florida and on a national level, since you serve in Congress, what needs to be done?
Well, I think that that particular bill needs to be tweaked, that particular law. And we already have senators who's looking at it, because when the bill was passed, nobody ever dreamed that it would cause these kinds of situations. In fact, in the state of Florida, when I was in the state Senate, I passed a bill that's called the Commission on the status, the social status of black men and boys, simply because we have such a real issue about black men and boys in this nation. And we need to stop and look at all of those things that's happening. That particular law needs to be tweaked. It needs to be changed. It needs to be investigated. And that council would be a great place to begin to look at it. And I don't think that was the intent of the law. I think that it's being misused in this particular instance. This is racial profiling, and this is murder. This has absolutely nothing to do with stand your ground.
Can I just say something about this law? I mean, I read the law, and it seems to me that there's two things that need to be said about it. One is that Trayvon Martin was actually the person who could be using this self-defense argument because he was not the aggressor. He was the one who was attacked. He was in a place where he had a lawful right to be, and he was defending himself from attack from George Zimmerman. The other point is that the law does not apply, according to Florida Statute 776041, it does not apply for aggressors. And I think it's crazy how the chief of police has used this to justify
exactly right.
To justify George Zimmerman's behavior. There have been plenty of cases. The Orlando Sentinel documented these cases where police in Central Florida actually arrested people who made self-defense claims. That is an argument for the judge and jury to decide, not for a police chief on the street to make.
I have heard a number of people who have written very eloquently about this to say that if there is a silver lining, it is that it's opened up this dialogue. And it is now a national conversation. One person we have not heard from up until this point, Ben Jealous, is the president. Would you like to hear him speak about this?
You know, I think that the president really is speaking through his Department of Justice, which is investigating this case. And I really got to go back to this point. You know, any chief who so misinterprets a law of this magnitude, a law that gives permissions to citizens under certain situations to use lethal force, that chief is a danger to his community. Because the reality is that no reasonable person could look at this law and think that it gave license to George Zimmerman to hunt down and kill a little boy.
That chief
the reality
needs to be
is,
fired.
He needs to go.
And we should say that the vote of no confidence that was taken against him last night has no force, so there is no indication, at least at this point, that that will happen.
The city manager should fire him, or they should fire the city manager.
So much more to talk about, and I do wish we had more time. But Ben Jealous, thank you so much. Congresswoman Frederica Wilson, I know you have that sign that sits outside the door of your office that counts the number of days with no arrest since Trayvon's murder. Joanne Reed, thank you so much for being there in Florida for us.
Thank you.
And of course, Keith Boynton, it's always good to see you as well. And by the way, the city manager is going to be on Andrea Mitchell Reports at 1 o'clock Eastern time, so you'll want to watch that right here on MSNBC. And